This is the coming revolution in higher consciousness. Listen now to Elizabeth Clare Prophet, educator, author, and authority on the most exciting story of our time, the coming revolution in higher consciousness.
On the Defense of Freedom 4. Strategic defense, pros and cons. Now, if someone wanted to ensure that the U.S. never has a strategic defense, he would go about it in the same way Ronald Reagan is going about SDI. It's built-in failure. While President Reagan took a major step by making defense an integral part of our strategic doctrine, he has sabotaged his own project. In his March 23, 1983 address, the President said, "Tonight, consistent with our obligations of the ABM Treaty and recognizing the need for closer consultation with our allies, I'm taking an important first step. I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles." That is exactly what the President got. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative ignores the readily available low-tech solutions and concentrates on the high-tech, near-perfect systems of the future. This is the least optimal and most dangerous deployment strategy. Dangerous because the delay will give the Soviets time to outflank us in every area of defense, using our technology in many cases while we seek the perfect solution. The best plan is a two-track program to immediately redress a dire situation while researching for the future. But Reagan's SDI doesn't call for that, and that is its failing. In his speech, by saying that SDI would be consistent with our obligations of the ABM Treaty, Reagan implied that he planned to stay within the treaty, and to this date, he has never said he wants to get out of it. This is an essential first step in any kind of deployment. The United States needs a strategic defense now because it is vulnerable to a Soviet first strike, as I've pointed out in my earlier lectures. Strategic defense will not only strengthen deterrence, but it will also assist arms control. Since the systems I support have no offensive capability, they would be helping force the Soviets to the bargaining table without threatening them. Reagan's SDI is actually sabotaging what chance we have for a strategic defense. The President left the program wide open to attack by the media. A White House press briefing just prior to the address made it clear that the program the President envisioned would use such things as lasers and beam weapons. This led to SDI being dubbed Star Wars. Consequently, the discussion and criticism of strategic defense has focused on the hard-to-define future technologies, and until recently has been silent about near-term deployment. The combination of exotic technologies and the President's challenge to the scientists to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete was an entree for those who so desired to misconstrue SDI as a call for an Astrodome defense. Many people base their opposition to strategic defense solely on this fact. They reduce the argument to an Astrodome or no Astrodome and since a leak-proof defense over the U.S. is probably impossible in this century, they can safely dismiss strategic defense. In a debate over SDI funding, Democratic Senator J. Bennett Johnston attacked SDI. He said, "There has been no breakthrough. There has been no discovery. We are not on the threshold of building a new weapons system." What did he say? The president said, "We are going to build, in effect, an Astrodome over the United States to make nuclear weapons obsolete." So opponents can focus on high-tech solutions and thus dismiss all strategic defense. This became, therefore, and still is, an all-or-nothing proposition. It's very dangerous to deal with all-or-nothing propositions because you miss the best solutions in the middle, when you will take only all or nothing. Wouldn't you rather have half a basket of apples? You know, Earth is the middle solution. It's not the all of heaven, it's not the nothing of hell, it's the middle solution. It serves us quite well. Supposing we said nothing doing, I'm not going to embody on that planet, I have to have all or nothing. Well, you'd probably get nothing. Some congressmen have charged, and rightly so, that Reagan's SDI is ineffective and incorrectly focused. They are attempting to rectify the program. Senator Malcolm Wallop recently tried to get Congress to allocate $800 million for a system that could be deployed in the next 5 to 7 years. His goal was to ensure that some of the money for SDI would actually give something useful to ourselves. Senator Wallop had been a major proponent of near-term deployment for 6 years before Reagan launched SDI. Although Reagan's speech focused public attention on American vulnerability, Wallop found that it obscured the practical solutions. He recently got to the heart of the problem with SDI when he said, speaking of himself and General Daniel Graham of High Frontier, "We know that we did not ask our fellow citizens to spend time investigating questionable technologies. Rather, from the very beginning, almost a decade ago, we asked our fellow citizens to use all means at hand to defend this country against Soviet missiles. I re-emphasize that we never asked for research into hypothetical future means of defending against hypothetical future threats. Rather, we sought to use existing means to defend against existing threats. From the beginning, ours was a practical commitment that dealt with known quantities." End of quote from Senator Wallop. Wallop has made an effort to get the administration to define SDI in more practical terms, but so far he has not been successful. Representative Jack Kemp, Republican from New York, plans to make his 1988 presidential campaign a national referendum for Star Wars. All the more so since it's going to be difficult for Jack Kemp or any politician to successfully promote near-term deployment when Reagan, portrayed in the media as a warmonger, has not done so. That means we have to get after and challenge the media. That means writing your letters to the editor, getting in and being a part of the action. Why then has the president failed to promote near-term deployment? Why did he take the high-tech, long-term approach in the first place? He was aware of the low-tech systems. In 1980, General Daniel Graham, head of High Frontier, briefed him about point and area defenses, as well as the low-tech, space-based kinetic kill vehicle system. Reagan is either willfully allowing himself to be controlled by his advisors or to be bamboozled by bureaucrats. Either way, he ought to wake up. The Reagan administration is sabotaging strategic defense, whether or not the chief knows it. One of the most frequent arguments against near-term deployment is that it would violate the ABM treaty. But the Soviets have violated it, and they are well on their way to building their own SDI. The ABM treaty is dead, We can't crouch behind a paper shield when the enemy is building one out of radars and missiles. One of the answers most frequently given as to why the U.S. hasn't built a defense is Pentagon millicrats, military bureaucrats who oppose strategic defense. Why would the military oppose strategic defense? First of all, many officers were schooled in the doctrine of MAD. Second, SDI is a threat to individual bureaucrats. If Congress spends more money on strategic defense, it will spend less on fighters, tanks, ships, and various other weapons systems that have given military officials prestige, power, and advancement in their careers. After examining strategic defense in the early 80s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff reluctantly concluded that it was possible. But they did not support it. They were unable to stop the president, however, from making his Star Wars speech, because he didn't let anyone in the Pentagon know what he was going to say. They couldn't stop him from launching the initiative, but that doesn't mean they couldn't or wouldn't damage it after he, as per his managerial style, delegated it to them. Pentagon officials were given the responsibility of defining the research criteria for the Fletcher Commission. Under the direction of NASA administration, Dr. James Fletcher, the commission was assigned to study whether or not a defense such as Reagan had outlined could work. And sure enough, when the panel's 1984 report came out, it was unfavorable. General Graham explains how and why the report was controlled. First, the chiefs of the Department of Defense Research were put in charge of the commission. These were the men who might lose control of some research programs to a new entity set up to pursue SDI. They, of all Pentagon officials, were most likely to have their oxen gored by a favorable Fletcher Commission report. So what did they do? General Graham says they insisted that no technology be examined that would not provide a 99.99% perfect system. In other words, Dr. Fletcher was to ignore any solution which would let more than 1 out of 10,000 warheads pass through the defense. To his great credit, Dr. Fletcher balked at conducting a fruitless examination of the possibilities of technical perfection. He wanted to examine the realities of what could be done. But the best he could do was to force the bureaucrats to ease the problem to a search for a 99.9% perfect defense versus the 99.99. After much tribulation, he got permission to publish an annex to the study which presented a near-term option that, not surprisingly, closely resembled General Graham's high frontier. It is not at all clear whether a 99.99% effective system is even possible. Furthermore, even a 50% effective defense would most likely keep the Soviets from ever pushing the button. They seem to have lost sight of the goal. In any case, a requirement of 99.9% put deployment so far into the future as to postpone it indefinitely. Not built-in obsolescence, built-in failure. Critics of SDI used the Fletcher report extensively to show that it would never work. Yet near-term deployment had not even been an option for the Commission. Imagine if every one of us here were to be canceled if we could not perform our divine plan to a 99.99 perfection. Nobody would be left on earth, would they? Not one. The illogic of it must point to other reasons, other forces, other controls. It is the mind of America that is under attack. Destroy the mind, and the body simply follows suit. The minds of our youth by drugs and rock, it goes on and on. The mind of America is where Armageddon is being fought, the mental belt of this planet. The Hoffman Commission was a second panel that convened to study strategic defense. It asked, what will deter the Soviets? It concluded in 1983 that the U.S. should start with limited, near-term deployment of available systems, even though they were not 99.9% effective. We could graduate later to better systems, but our government did not take action on the Hoffman Report. There have been any number of objections raised against strategic defense in general and SDI in particular. All of them are, in my opinion, fallacious. We need to stop saying what if and start building something. The following news clip shows a number of the arguments raised against SDI. I'd like you to take note that the bias of the reporter, Bob Zelnick, is so apparent that he falsely accuses the Pentagon of lying about the success of a laser test. ABC retracted it in next night's report.
We were talking today about the legacy that Ronald Reagan will leave the country, and it was fitting in part because this is the 4th anniversary of the occasion when the president outlined his vision of a defense system in space, one that would protect the United States from nuclear attack. The president calls it SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. It is more widely known as Star Wars. Tonight and tomorrow, we're going to bring you up to date on how far along it is and how it is faring in the political wars which have marked its development. Our Pentagon correspondent Bob Zelnick is on special assignment.
This is deterrence as we have come to know it. Nuclear missiles so powerful that only a madman would provoke attack, so numerous that even those remaining after an attack could wreak devastation on an enemy.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not...
But in his famous Star Wars speech, the president called on science to protect people, not just missiles, urging a strategic defense initiative that would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
We could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies.
38.9 on the right-half side.
Since then, more than $8 billion has been spent by scientists trying to develop an SDI system both feasible to deploy and more efficient to defend than to attack. Officials have proclaimed success upon success.
We're making very, very good progress, much faster than we thought we could.
But some well-publicized experiments appear to have had higher public relations than scientific value. For example, SDI officials hailed the destruction of this missile as a landmark achievement of chemical laser technology. Only later was it learned the missile was destroyed by ordinary explosives. Chemical laser beams are still too weak. A Senate staff report quoted one senior SDI scientist as warning that the desire to show breakthroughs could cause SDI experiments to degenerate into a series of sleazy stunts. The political need to show quick results may also be steering the administration toward deployment of a less capable technology. For example, the key to any SDI defense involves intercepting Soviet missiles during their boost phase, which now lasts about 6 minutes. If the intercept fails, the attacking missiles release their warheads and decoys, perhaps tens of thousands of objects, which could overwhelm defenses closer to target. Potentially, laser weapons are best suited to intercept during the boost phase, because they're fast enough to do the job from high orbit, where they're less vulnerable. But because lasers may still be decades from deployment, SDI officials have turned to an older technology, kinetic kill vehicles, weapons which would destroy Soviet missiles by shooting bullet-like pellet clusters into them. But there are big drawbacks. Kinetic weapons are slow and must travel in low orbit to be near target, where both they and the multi-billion-dollar sensor satellites that guide them would be vulnerable to Soviet attack.
At the moment, it looks like satellites in low Earth orbit are sitting ducks.
Also, by moving to a solid fuel, fast burn booster, technology the Russians already possess, Soviet missiles could cut their boost phase in half and simply outrun kinetic defenses. SDI scientists have spent thousands of man-hours trying to make SDI work against predicted Soviet countermeasures. But the net result is a system which experts overwhelmingly agree cannot approach President Reagan's goal of a leak-proof population shield.
I think that the dream is unrealistic, certainly within the foreseeable future, and perhaps forever.
Any of these systems is probably leak-proof in a small attack and leaky to some extent or other in a very large attack.
Those responsible for SDI argue that even an imperfect system makes a Soviet attack less likely by lowering the prospects for military success.
The head of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, we want him to know that he will never be able to have absolute certainty that the missile that he targets anywhere will be the one that gets through several layers of defense.
I should think that a system that was even 20 or 30% effective would create such uncertainties about the ability to carry out an attack that it would be highly stabilizing.
But what to Americans would seem insurance against a first Soviet strike could appear to the Soviets preparation by the U.S. for a first strike of its own, with SDI in place to deal with what remained of the Soviet missile force. The notion of a perfect nuclear shield, a kind of anti-missile astrodome, is already dead in the view of most scientists. The question is whether by threatening to neutralize much of the Soviet missile force, SDI would decrease or increase the risk that the Russians would strike first. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Tonight, a second report from our Pentagon correspondent, Bob Zelnick. And a paradox. The very technology that could make SDI so powerful may also make it vulnerable.
With many of the nation's top scientists and engineers focused on SDI, some technologies once thought promising have now become long shots. For example, railguns, which fire lethal pellets at high speeds, have proven too tough to aim, while requiring too much power to be based in space. Laser beams powered by chemicals are simply not strong enough to destroy enemy missiles. A miniaturized version of this neutral particle beam accelerator may one day be able to bounce a hydrogen atom off a Soviet warhead to determine whether it's real or a decoy. But to kill Soviet missiles, the best long-run hope is the free electron laser, which could be based on U.S. soil while using sensors and huge mirrors in orbit to zero in on Soviet missiles still in their boost phase.
In the last 9 years, we've made up list after list of things that could go wrong, and we still haven't found a reason it won't work.
But decades may be needed to solve practical problems. This facility at Albuquerque's Sandia Laboratory will test the vulnerability of SDI components to gamma rays, a critical question. For if the SDI system itself invites nuclear attack, it can hardly contribute to stability in a crisis. The question of vulnerability haunts those working on SDI.
A very severe problem SDI has, that inventing these weapon systems to shoot down such hard targets, if the Soviets were to have these same kind of weapon systems, it would be potentially easier for them to shoot down the defensive assets.
That is, the mirrors, sensors, and SDI weapons themselves. Thus, the ultimate and perhaps fatal irony of SDI, the system's vulnerability to its own lethal technology. Among ways to protect SDI is a political strategy, many urging the U.S. to declare keep-out zones around SDI satellites, including those above Soviet territory, and destroy would-be threats entering those zones.
We would know they're there and be ready to move against them if they moved within a lethal radius from our own satellites.
And if the Soviets actually attacked SDI satellites?
It might be that American opinion would crystallize into a very strong response, namely taking out the Soviet weapons which were destroying our defensive system.
But to many, this seems more a formula for crisis than stability.
Do we want to move to a world in which we declare by fiat, we're putting a system up in space which is a threat to your deterrent, but if you come near it, we're going to destroy you?
Some suggest another scenario, the negotiated deployment of SDI systems by both superpowers, together with deep cuts in offensive weapons.
The situation we have today is massive retaliation. That's all we have as our deterrent force. What we're talking about here is a transition to mutually assured survival.
Maybe so, but at Reykjavik, the Soviets rejected this approach.
We have to look for a way of changing the reality, the very severe and dangerous reality based on deterrence, but not by changing it to completely irrational utopia.
The potential for active Soviet opposition to SDI makes deploying the system much more difficult than, say, putting a man on the moon.
It would be like putting a man on the moon when the moon didn't want to be landed on and could put out decoys or fire back or run away or turn out its lights.
Critics and supporters are agreed on the need to aggressively pursue SDI technologies, given the robust Soviet effort on lasers and other advanced systems.
I think not to understand the potential of that technology would leave us in for a surprise that we wouldn't want to deal with.
It is at the rush toward deployment where critics draw the line.
We should not anchor ourselves to deployment without having solved the technical problems and without facing the strategic problems simply because somebody wants to establish momentum behind the program or because somebody wants to trash the ABM treaty.
The notion that there's no defense save the threat of retaliation against the enemy's most fearsome weapons runs counter to the spirit of this society and the basic instincts of mankind. But the bridge from defense to deterrence was crossed at the very dawn of the nuclear age. And once having crossed that bridge, this country is finding it very hard to turn back. Bob Zelnick, ABC News, Washington.
And we have one other note. Last night, Bob Zelnick said that during a landmark test of chemical laser technology, the test missile in question had actually been destroyed by ordinary explosives because the chemical laser beams were too weak. That was not the case, and our reporting was in error. It was the laser beam which destroyed the missile, and we are sorry about the mistake.
If it is true that the nation is finding it very hard to go back from deterrence to defense, it is our decree at this 4th of July that it is no longer going to be very hard. You heard a number of pros and cons presented by Bob Zelnick. So let's take the arguments one by one. First, a KKV system would be vulnerable to Soviet attack. Our answer to this argument is there would be about 2,000 satellites in our KKV system. It would take the Soviets several days to shoot them down. If they started shooting at them, the U.S. would have ample time for a strong response. Mr. President, no defense has ever been invulnerable. No offense has ever been invulnerable. A medieval fortress could be breached by a cannonball, but castle walls were not taken down when the cannon was invented. This argument is nothing but a smokescreen for those who, by an oblique psychology, still feel safer undefended. Mr. President, we know that you do not believe in being undefended. Argument 2. A strategic defense would threaten the Soviets' missiles. On the news clip, scientist Sidney Drell said that an SDI would threaten the Soviets' deterrent, that is, their ICBMs. But the only way a kinetic kill vehicle could attack a Soviet ICBM is if the Soviets had attacked and the ICBM was in space. Soviet missiles on the ground would be as safe as they are now. If we deployed lasers in space, we could threaten the Soviets. But they are not an option since the technology isn't ready. Argument 3. Deployment of a strategic defense violates the ABM treaty. The Reagan administration, especially the State Department, has tried to prove that near-term deployment is legal within the bounds of the treaty, the so-called broad interpretation. Others say it is not. In either case, the Soviets have violated the treaty so many times that they have abrogated it in everything but name. The Krasnoyarsk radar is a violation by the very fact that it sits more than 300 miles from the Soviet border and is pointed inward. The Krasnoyarsk radar is a case in point. The ABM treaty specifically prohibited such radars. The logic was that a radar pointed outward could be used for early warning, but one pointed inward could be used for battle management of ABMs. Krasnoyarsk is not a threat in itself, but combined with the Soviets' 8 other phased array radars positioned around the country, it blankets the most populated areas of Russia. Another violation is the fact that Soviet surface-to-air missiles are ABM capable. The evidence comes from 2 places. The Pentagon reports that some Soviet SAMs are definitely capable of being used against tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons and may be capable of shooting down ICBMs. But a Soviet colonel revealed in 1983 to defense expert Michael Dean that all 13,600 Soviet SAMs are ABM capable. They have anti-ballistic missiles. We do not. They have violated the treaty. The United States should stop wasting its time trying to prove SDI is okay under the treaty and simply withdraw from it. We have no business abiding by the terms of an arms control treaty that fatally undermines our national security, period. To President Ronald Reagan, the keepers of the flame of liberty of the free world, send the mandate to announce to Mikhail Gorbachev that the United States has come to its senses and we are pulling out of the 1972 ABM treaty within the prescribed 6-month time limit. Mr. President, we demand that you declare a state of national emergency and use your executive powers to order an immediate deployment of all available strategic defense systems. Mr. President, this must be done while there is yet time in your term of office. If you do not act now, it may be too late for any future president to put up a strategic defense. Mr. President, do not listen to the false prophets who tell you to sign an arms control agreement with the Soviets to preserve your place in history. In February, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger articulated your administration's position to Time magazine. He said this administration has firmly committed itself to not even making a decision for the rest of its time in office about whether the U.S. shall or shall not have an anti-missile defense. Mr. President, the only place in history you will have is to be remembered as the leader who declined the option to defend his nation from nuclear death and totalitarian enslavement by a barbaric enemy. Mr. President, we are standing at a crucial point in America's history. You must take action. We support you. We will support your decision to deploy a strategic defense regardless of what your advisors and the media say. Argument 4. SDI is too expensive. Opponents say it will cost $1 trillion, or maybe even $5 trillion, and that each increment of U.S. defense can be offset by a cheaper increment of Soviet offense. They say it is cheaper for the Soviets to build more missiles, offensive weapons, than it is for the United States to build a strategic defense, defensive weapons. Since with nuclear weapons the offense has the advantage, the argument goes, the nation that tries to defend itself will go bankrupt first. If you defend against 10,000 missiles, the 10,001st will destroy you. None of these objections withstands the rigors of analysis. First of all, if we mass-produced satellites for a KKV system, the price would be about $40 to $50 million apiece. Even if each satellite took out only one Soviet missile, which are worth about $350 million, it would be well worth the cost. Second, Tom Krebs, who briefed the President on Soviet space warfare capabilities in 1983, pointed out that you can design a system to cost almost anything. Given the propensity of the military bureaucracy to drive costs up, you can then make it even more expensive. High Frontier estimates a space-based KKV system will cost about $20 billion. The Pentagon and some independent analysts believe it will cost closer to $200 billion. These analysts who say this obviously have good reason to quote a $200 billion figure when $20 billion would do. Henry Kendall, chairman of the Union of Concerned Scientists, which opposes defense, says that any system, from a KKV to a particle beam weapon, will cost $1 trillion. The $1 trillion figure was based on a rough estimate by former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, and is almost certainly much too high. Even Schlesinger admitted it was a rough and ready estimate that was an extrapolation based on the 1975 safeguard system. A $200 billion figure for a complete space-based KKV system is much more realistic. We have spent that much or more on offensive strategic systems and stand to see most of our investment liquidated in 30 minutes or less by a Soviet first strike. And anyway, since when can somebody put a price on our lives and the lives of our children? We have to spend whatever it takes, whether it costs $200 billion or $1 trillion. $200 billion spent over 10 years means $80 per American per year. We owe that much to ourselves, our families, our nation, and our God. Mr. President, cost is not a question. Strategic defense, no matter how expensive, is cheaper than being incinerated by the Soviets. Argument 5. SDI will eliminate the possibility for arms control. It is obvious that SDI will not eliminate arms control. We've been pursuing SDI and carrying on arms control negotiations in Geneva on a wide range of issues for the last 25 months. Following the homing overlay experiment in 1984, when U.S. Star Wars technology shot down a warhead in space, Konstantin Chernenko sent his negotiators back to the table. Gorbachev accepted our proposal for a zero option in Europe with no cutback in our SDI programs. And he'll probably sign an INF agreement with no cutback in SDI. The fact is, SDI made the Soviets more willing to talk rather than less, however much they may squawk about the danger it poses to peace. Why are we so intimidated when the bear starts grumbling and growling? Argument 6, SDI is destabilizing. It could lead either to a U.S. first strike or to aggressive Soviet behavior, their invasion of another country, or a preemptive strike. All the fears raise their heads. Some argue stability stems from vulnerability. Professor Sheila Tobias of Iowa State University said, quote, "We must allow Soviet missiles a free ride to their targets," unquote. That's right. Tobias et al. Also say that SDI would give the U.S. a first strike capability. These clinker thinkers hold that if we are secure behind a shield, we will be free to attack the Soviet Union or any other nation. It is based on a behavioral approach to international relations, which treats nations as individuals who act on their primal instincts. Thus, they also hold that a U.S. defense would make the Soviets feel threatened and act aggressively. First of all, this argument fails to take into consideration the design of our forces. They just don't have the power to carry out a credible first strike, with or without strategic defense. Bob Zelnick is wearing his ignorance on his shirt sleeve by claiming the Soviets would fear a U.S. first strike. We're not capable of it, and Ivan knows it. Before operational, SDI could be destabilizing in that it might provoke the Soviets to launch a first strike to prevent deployment of a U.S. defense. We've all considered it. But the plain truth is that they could launch a first strike with or without SDI. This is why, Mr. President, we must deploy our point and area defenses immediately. Furthermore, this argument does not take into consideration the Soviet SDI. Will Tsar Wars, as Krebs calls it, make the U.S. act more aggressively? Or are we going to suddenly attack Canada or Mexico once we get up our SDI? Proponents of this argument see no moral difference between us and the Soviets. Maybe these eggheads should take a sabbatical in Siberia. Argument 7. SDI won't work. It will never be 100% effective. Even if it is 95% effective, which is too much to expect, the U.S. would suffer unacceptable damage. In a 10,000 warhead attack, 500 warheads would hit U.S. cities. We are safer with arms control. Well, first of all, since when did arms control give you 100% effective defense? Secondly, this argument assumes that only a perfect defense will work. In other words, it defines working as being 100% effective. It fails to recognize that in its initial stages, strategic defense will strengthen deterrence by diminishing the Soviets' confidence in their first strike ability. Even critics concede that the various systems being proposed would be 50 to 60% effective, and that is all we need. The argument that a 95% effective defense will not work because 500 warheads will hit American cities assumes that the Soviets target cities, that they will fire all their warheads at once, and that the 500 warheads that get through would each hit a separate city. We do not know for a fact what the Soviets have targeted, but all the data available to us suggests that they target our military facilities. This data includes the structure of their strategic forces, their doctrine, and a mathematical projection of Soviet missile trajectories made in the 60s when the missiles were stored outdoors. They may target some cities, such as Washington, D.C., which have immediate strategic value, and their second strike plans may target cities. But there is little evidence that the Soviets have a counter-value policy of attacking population centers rather than missile silos. I agree with Tom Krebs that the Soviets don't really want to incinerate the country, but I do believe that they are paranoid and that they would not rest easy until they had disarmed us with a counterforce attack. Based on the Soviet mentality, they have to destroy our ability to attack them, and in the process, sacrifice a small segment of our population. They could then invade and rule. Finally, neither we nor the Soviets have any way of knowing beforehand which warheads targeted at what will get through a defense. This uncertainty, given their paranoia, could make them postpone their first strike on our defenses. Thus, as far as I'm concerned, a strategic defense will definitely buy us time. Time we need so desperately for Saint-Germain. If 500 warheads did penetrate the defenses over our missile fields, we might lose between 175 and 250 missiles, since silos are usually attacked with 2 or 3 warheads. That would leave us with our cities intact and with 750 or more ICBMs. If the inhabitants of the cities downwind of the missile fields had civil defense, civilian casualties would be limited. A large number of people might still lose their lives, but it would by no means be the end of the nation. We all agree that nuclear war is a terrible thing and pray that it never happens. But if or when the Soviets carry out their first strike intent, I would rather have 5% of the missiles get through than all of them. America, we are not going to let a sleazy, suicidal argument like this stand in the way of the defense of freedom and the defense of the lives of our families and communities. America, we will all meet our Maker, whether sooner or later depends on the decisions we make on self-defense. But when we do meet our Maker, the fact that we believe the lie that defense wouldn't work will be an indictment upon ourselves, and we will hear the stinging words pronounced upon our generation. Their judgment is just. Mr. President, don't listen to the naysayers who say a defense must be perfect. We live in the now and we must act now with existing technology. Just say the word and we'll rally behind you. Argument 8. Strategic defenses can be overcome by cruise missiles and depressed trajectory sub-launched ballistic missiles. This argument contains a little truth and a lot of falsity. Depressed trajectory ballistic missiles, those which do not fly outside the atmosphere into space, where they can be attacked by a space-based system, have not been deployed. Even if they have been deployed, Soviet sub-launched ballistic missiles are not accurate enough to destroy hardened missile silos and command centers. Cruise missiles are accurate enough to hit such high priority targets, but cannot carry large enough warheads to destroy them. In the future, SLBMs and perhaps cruise missiles will develop a counterforce capacity, but they can be intercepted by surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, and point defenses, and possibly in the future, lasers and other high-tech weapons. The Soviets are already developing an impressive anti-cruise missile capability with their SAMs and air defenses. Mr. President, we must defend now against the threat that exists now, namely 8,258 Soviet warheads aimed at us. What the Soviets will do in the future is not yet crystallized. There is time to act. Argument 9, countermeasures. The Soviets will take actions to neutralize our defense. This is supposed to be the real Achilles heel of strategic defense, according to its opponents. The Soviets can easily employ fast burn boosters, graphite coating, build thousands more warheads, and easily, quickly, and decisively defeat any defense the U.S. puts up. Therefore, we better not start, because we'll be pouring our money into a black hole. Our only hope is arms control. So the argument drones on. However, this argument assumes that if the Soviets take countermeasures, the U.S. will do nothing. It appears that its proponents would allow our investment in strategic defense to be liquidated rather than employ countermeasures. These critics also assume that we are not already thinking about countermeasures and countermeasures. They imply that countermeasures are something new. In reality, we've worked extensively on countermeasures for 2 decades. Critics assume that it's cheap and easy for the Soviets to employ countermeasures. To the best of anyone's knowledge, the Soviets have yet to deploy countermeasures. Actually, if you think about it, they couldn't deploy them until we deployed a defense, because until then, they wouldn't know what system to counter. And if, as I pointed out earlier, we used a variety of defense systems, it would make their efforts to deploy countermeasures very difficult and very costly. The critics of SDI want any system we deploy to be perfect, capable of defeating any missiles now deployed, or any that anyone could ever think of deploying for the next 25 years. Talk about paralysis by analysis. One countermeasure they discuss is a fast burn booster. This would cut the time of the boost phase in half and thereby defeat U.S. efforts to destroy a missile before it releases its warheads. It is not at all certain that a shortened boost phase would neutralize our strategic defense, and it certainly would do nothing about the other layers of defense. And even if a fast burn booster could circumvent a boost phase defense, could the Soviets deploy it? Apparently, the critics of SDI are not asking such questions. They seem to believe and want to make everyone else believe that Soviet countermeasures would no sooner be said than done. Critics also say that the Soviets could paint their missiles with a mirror coating to reflect laser beams. This view has numerous fallacies. To date, no one has found a mirror coating that will stay on a missile as it flies through the atmosphere. Lasers can kill a missile in other ways. We could still kill a mirror-coated missile with a particle beam weapon. If the Soviets decided to put a graphite or other type of coating on their missiles to force us to increase the power of our attacking lasers or particle beam weapons, they would significantly increase the weight of the rocket. It is not easy or cheap for them to coat more than 1,000 ICBMs, nor to replace the booster in order to enable the missile to carry the extra weight. And if they had to defend against both a laser and a beam weapon, the problem would become even more complex. This raises another question. How easy is it for the Soviets to adapt to U.S. defenses? They are very good at mass production once they get their lines set up and work out the bugs in their system. But they do not have unlimited economic resources to carry out research and development and then production. Their military machine is already running as fast as it can. How can they produce any more weapons when they are already going all out? An even bigger problem for the Soviets is engineering and innovation. The great weakness in the Soviet system is in applied technology, how to put their conceptualizations into concrete form. These uncertainties make it unlikely that the Soviets would spend so much time, money, and effort for so little probability of success. And this, of course, diminishes their confidence in ever using their weapons. Decoys are probably the most frequently discussed countermeasure. The Soviets could use hardened mylar balloons that look like warheads to radar, the argument goes. The space-based defense would not be able to discriminate between real warheads and decoys, and thus it would be presented with more targets than it could cope with. Decoys are a challenge, but they are not as insurmountable as they seem. According to Dr. Alan Mency, chief scientist at the Pentagon's SDI office, there are about 24 ways of dealing with decoys during mid-course, most of which are classified. One unclassified method, which Mency discussed with us, involves special sensors. He said if a high-energy particle beam hits a lightweight decoy, it will pass right through it because it's thin. But when it hits a real weapon, a real RV, it gets stuck. It burrows right inside and causes other kinds of nuclear reactions which give off neutrons and gamma rays and other kinds of nuclear particles. We have sensors up there that look for those things, and so our sensors are going to think, we see a signal, that is an RV. So it's like putting on a special pair of glasses that only sees heavy things. Clearly, countermeasures are theoretical and should be dealt with as they come. I've found in life that problems and their solutions follow the flow of events. It's not possible to solve tomorrow's problem, next year's problems, the problem of the next decade, all in one day. As we move toward the problem, the solutions to the problem unfold. They unfold from within by the higher mind of God, to which all people have access. The point is that even as far back as the late 60s, every problem that critics raised could have been overcome if we had had the national will to deploy a strategic defense. Safeguard was criticized. Environmentalists opposed it because it used a 4-megaton warhead to destroy incoming ICBM warheads. Others worried that the electromagnetic pulse Safeguard's nuclear blast would set off during the intercept would blind U.S. radar and interrupt communications. Still others worried about the cost. Years earlier, however, the Navy had proposed a system which would have circumvented these problems. A sea-based ballistic missile intercept system, SABMISS. SABMISS would have deployed ships in the North Atlantic and Pacific whose sea-based interceptor missiles could shoot down Soviet or Chinese-launched ICBMs over the ocean. This would have avoided the problems of radar blinding and pollution, and also made it possible to intercept the ICBMs before they could release their multiple warheads. However, SABMISS was never deployed because of inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy. The Army wanted to control our defense. Sea basing would have put it under the Navy. As a result, SABMISS was rejected, and a limited safeguard program was the only ABM system submitted for consideration by the U.S. government. Mr. President, there is one Soviet countermeasure that is potentially 100% effective. It's the Soviets talking us out of deploying any strategic defense system. If they can convince us that it's unnecessary, destabilizing, ineffective, too costly, or counterproductive, they will have developed the ultimate countermeasure, one that introduces no uncertainties into the equation. This countermeasure does not have to succeed for very long. As I pointed out earlier, the Soviets are well on their way to developing their own land-based strategic defense, and thereby to having the ultimate drawing card, the capability of launching a first strike, or getting us to surrender by the threat of a first strike, to which, without SDI, we would have no chance of successfully responding. The conclusion of our present no-defense posture is that without SDI, we are limiting our options to zero. If the Soviets build their strategic defense before we build ours, Mr. President, any arms control treaty you negotiate is worthless. The two most determined critics of strategic defense, the Soviets and the arms control lobby, know defense will work. The arms controllers negotiated the ABM treaty, limiting the numbers of ABMs we could deploy. They too know that defense is so effective it will mean the end of mutual assured destruction. The Soviets believe it will work. They're building their defenses as fast as they can. Let's take a look. The following slides show Soviet strategic defense. The first one is the Soviet ABM system guarding Moscow. The next is a Galosh ABM defending Moscow. Next, we see Soviet SAMs. They have deployed 13,600 SAM launchers around the country. Some are ABM capable. Others are capable of shooting down cruise missiles or battlefield nuclear weapons. No one knows how many SAMs they have produced. Many more than 13,000 could be stockpiled for quick reload. Next is a Soviet doghouse radar, providing battle management for the ABM interceptors around Moscow. Next you see the Soviet henhouse early warning radars. Next, the Pechora-class large phased array radar used for battle management. The next one shows total radar coverage of the Soviet Union, including the henhouse, dog and cat house, and phased array radars. Next, you see a diagram of Soviet launch detection and over-the-horizon radars. The United States has no such radars. Next, you see the United States ballistic missile defense radars. The Soviets may even beat us in building a space-based KKV, that kinetic kill vehicle system, one of the few near-term options we have. Tom Krebs, who until recently was the Pentagon's chief analyst on Soviet space warfare capabilities, says they are preparing to deploy one. He says that once the Soviets deploy their Tsar Wars strategic defense, they will be able to prevent us from deploying our own space-based system. He said, the presumption on the part of the American people is that if SDI is going to get built, we're going to build it. And if we don't build it, it won't be built. And if we build it 10 years later, the first SDI system would be 10 years later. And that's just assuming away an awful lot of Soviet capability. After years of analyzing Soviet space programs, Tom Krebs concluded that the Soviets are well on their way to deploying a KKV system, that network of satellites which destroys missiles and their warheads with kinetic energy. The components of the system the Soviets are working on include plans for a space station carrying perhaps 100 men, The Soviets, he emphasizes, are past masters of space stations. The Soviet system also includes development and testing of a space plane, the ability to perform 2 space launches per day, the capability to deploy 50 satellites per launch, and the development of a space shuttle modeled after ours, but with improvements. On May 15th of this year, they deployed the Energia, a heavy-lift launch vehicle that can carry 4 times the weight of our space shuttle. Now you see the slide of this heavy-lift launch vehicle, the Energia, which will enable them to rapidly deploy a KKV system when ready. Next, I'm going to show you the components of a Soviet space-based KKV system. Here you see the Soviet Mir space station, Peace. Then there's an artist's impression of a future Soviet space station. A Soviet reusable space plane. SL-4 heavy-lift launch vehicles. Soviet launch vehicles. There's a U.S. space shuttle in diagram on the left. Next is a graph showing the comparison of the United States, the blue line, and Soviet red line space launches from 1960 to 1985. In 85, we had 15, they had 98. Next, the Soviet space shuttle. If you think this looks suspiciously like the Columbia or the Challenger, you're right. Next is the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger. The Soviet used our plans, which were available to the public, added a few improvements, and started building, saving themselves $7 billion. We let them reap the benefits of our years of research. The space capabilities the Soviets are developing would give them the ability to deploy the 2,000 satellites a KKV system calls for, and maintain the system by using the space plane to fly damaged satellites to the space station for replacement or repair. The kinds of programs we know they have could be used only for a space-based defense. There are no scientific programs which need capabilities of this kind. The Soviet space program is driven by military needs, as defectors have warned us repeatedly. Once the Soviets deploy a space-based system, it could be too late for us to deploy our own. It may already be too late. Krebs believes the Soviets could deploy a system and then say, "Do not deploy your satellites or we will shoot them down." And we wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. Then, barring a miracle, the Soviets would have a checkmate. The bear's trap is about to be sprung, but the administration is carrying on business as usual. "America, awake," as the town crier used to cry. "Awake, fire, fear, foes, awake. It's a national emergency." If the Soviets succeed in ringing the earth with satellites and completing their KKV system, but for the grace of Almighty God, we are finished. "America, awake! Fire, fear, foes, awake! It's a national emergency. Except for divine intervention, we will never regain military superiority." John Collins, the Library of Congress chief Soviet analyst, concluded that whoever gets ahead in space will have a 50-year military advantage over the rest of the world. 50 years, that is what Saint Germain asked for. Now you know he was asking for a 50-year military advantage by having freedom in space. We know how the Soviets would use their military advantage, and we can bet they wouldn't treat us like we treated them when we enjoyed supremacy from 1945 to 1975. If we are going to gain 50 years of world peace and enlightenment for Saint Germain, we must stop the Soviets in space. Our government has failed to provide for the common defense and to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, and we have not called them to task for it. Mr. President, it does no good to talk big and do nothing. America doesn't have to. We are big and we can do something. While the nation sleeps, rocked in the cradle of the media, and politicians saving their skins and losing their souls, the enemy stalks space. The American people believe you have acted in their best interest and in their best defense. They believe they are defended against a Soviet first strike. But you and I know we are no closer to having a defense than we were on March 23rd, 1983. Is that day, well chosen for the words of Patrick Henry, is it going to go down in history as the day the defense of America was co-opted? Or is the only one who can impel decisive action going to do it now? President Reagan, you are on center stage, and we, the American people, are behind you. Is it going to be a chorus line to national suicide? Or will we hear the heart of America's patriot sound the only honorable choice? Give me liberty or give me death. You, Mr. President, have the power to bring permanent peace to the planet and to be remembered as the knight of the 20th century who acted decisively to secure space for freedom. It is amazing how we come to realize that our hopes are pinned in one man's decision. And I think we have to quickly remember that our hopes are really pinned in Almighty God. But knowing that He does have the power to act, I feel our prayers should be mighty and intense to Saint Germain and the archangels to overshadow our president and to reinforce his mantle. It is an amazing time we live in to understand that in this hour, keepers of the flame, minutes are ticking and this decision hangs in the balance. We all have many roles, and I think we all realize how our missions are opposed, how what we desire to do when we serve, we must decree for and pray for and be alert and astute and expose the lie to keep on keeping on. So we must have compassion for a man who must be under the greatest pressures of anyone in America simply because the Soviets know, the liberals know, death and hell knows that he could make the difference. I ask you then to truly support him and to support the Ascended Master's own choice candidates in all coming elections, to be diligent and to be watchful. I ask that we pray also that at some level of his being he will receive this message and to feel the love that is so great of all the people who elected him to office. Lord God Almighty, before thy altar of the Holy Grail and this chalice within each heart, we submit then our lectures and deliveries on the defense of freedom to thy keeping and to the keeping of thy holy angels. We commend President Ronald Reagan, his family, and all representatives in government of the American people and of the free world into thy keeping and into the electronic presence. Now, O Lord of the seven archangels, seal our message, O God. Mercury and hosts of the Lord, bring it to the ear of every heart on earth. Let God now come to earth. Thou who hast determined to save this earth, Lord God Almighty, come to earth through our hearts and the hearts of all light bearers. Deliver us, O God, in the name Jesus Christ, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Mother, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for your very, very kind and warm attention.
You've been watching The Coming Revolution in Higher Consciousness with Elizabeth Clare Prophet. The preceding public access program has been presented through the assistance of Church Universal and Triumphant, Box A, Livingston, Montana, 59047, 1390. If you would like to know more, call this number or write this address.